Okay, I'm John Silver. I'm a member of the executive of the Men's Club. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation. Just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping things. Those of you who are not members of the club, the gentlemen amongst us, we would invite you to become members. You're always welcome to attend our programs, but the more members we have, the more programming we can put on. And if you happen to have had your membership lapse, we'd love you to renew it. That would be great. I have an exciting opportunity for some of you as well. We are looking for one or two new members of the Men's Club Executive. So I hope a number of you will rush towards me at the end of today's program. Let me have your names and you'd like to join us. It's a fun little group. We get together from time to time and basically try and organize the programming from the year. Anyway, we're not here to hear any more about that. Our program tonight brings us Aaron Cass. Aaron is a long-time storyteller of Jewish stories, folk tales, over 30 years. Some of you may have had the pleasure of hearing him speak before. He spoke here when we had our series called Temple U on a Friday night, and I had that great pleasure of hearing him. I'm looking forward to hearing him again tonight. Aaron has performed at festivals, synagogues, schools, and much more. In his daytime job, he's a palliative care physician, and as a medical student, he was deeply involved in writing, acting, singing, and directing medical satire. He lives in Vancouver, and he's a member of Temple Sholom. His presentation tonight is The Stories We Tell Ourselves. Aaron, thank you for being here. Please welcome him.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? No. All right. Let's try that again. More volume from the back? Okay. Much more. All right. How's that? Still no. John? Hold. Okay. All right. Try that again. How's that? Yes? Sort of? Oh, Lord. Can it go any louder? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just tell me when you think it's adequate. Is that good? All right. Great. Thank you, everyone. So good evening. Thank you, John. Welcome to The Stories We Tell Ourselves. So, what does it mean to be a Jewish folktale? This is a slight variation on the timeless question, what does it mean to be a Jew? So if you view Jewishness as a status conferred at birth, then a Jewish folktale is one that has its source as the Jewish people, even if the story is bereft of a single reference to Judaism. But if you believe that Jewishness stems from the history and the practice of Judaism, then a Jewish folk story is one that combines Jewish tradition with a classic fairy tale framework. So I'm going to be telling you 3 stories tonight, and the first one falls into the former category, and the next 2 into the latter. These stories are drawn from a collection called Elijah's Violin and Other Jewish Folk Tales, selected and retold by Howard Schwartz. Many of the stories I tell come from this collection, and the comments I'm going to be making about the stories also come from this book. So I entered the world of storytelling in my late teenage years. There is a gathering called 1001 Friday Nights of Storytelling that has met every Friday night in downtown Toronto since 1978, except for a brief pause when they had to go online during COVID. Now, when I initially read about this, I decided I would check it out as a spectator. And it's pretty amazing because the cultural diversity of Toronto was reflected in the stories I heard. There were tales from every continent except Antarctica, and I was hooked. So after some period of time, I had this crazy idea that I wanted to tell a story. And I had no background in public performance, and I was an inherently shy person. And my initial attempts were very unpolished. But it was a supportive crowd, and in time, I gained confidence. Now, there was only one rule at 1001 Friday Nights. You couldn't read your story. You had to tell it from memory. So after launching my storytelling career, I found out about another organization that a Jewish storytelling society that met once a month. And what I found was that although in the beginning I was telling stories from all different cultures, the stories I was most drawn to were Jewish folk tales. And so I started branching out. I was telling stories at schools, at festivals and talent nights. And then life got busy, and I got married. I entered medical training. I had a family, and my ability to participate in storytelling dropped quite a bit. But over the past 30 years, I've always maintained a connection to storytelling. So my first story is called Elijah's Violin, and it would be considered a ma'asiyah, or tale, as it does not have a strong connection to Jewish tradition. Elijah himself has only a cameo appearance. The origins can be traced back to Egypt, but the time frame is uncertain. Howard Schwartz asserts that there are more folk tales about Elijah than any other figure in Jewish folklore, but very few of them would be considered fairy tales. Elijah is typically shown helping the poor, and fairy tales tend to focus on the royal family. So the fact that Elijah's violin has all the characteristics of a classic fairy tale make it an outlier. The violin symbolizes the noble features of Elijah and also serves as a magical device. You could think of it as the Jewish equivalent of Aladdin's lamp. And so with that, sit back, relax, and listen as the violin begins to play. There once was a king who had 3 daughters. He loved them dearly, but one day he had to leave them to go off to war. Before he departed, he said to them, "If I am victorious in this war, I will bring you each a gift. Tell me, what would you like?" The eldest said, "I would like a diamond in the shape of a star." And the second said, "I would like a gown woven from pure gold." But the youngest said, "I only want you to return home safely from the war." The king said to his youngest, "I thank you for your good wish, but you must ask me for something. Think it over for 3 days, and then before I leave, tell me what you want." So the youngest daughter was sitting on a rock next to the lake outside the palace when an old woman appeared before her. "What is wrong, my child?" she said. And the princess replied, "I do not know what gift to ask of my father, the king." And the old woman said, "You must ask him for Elijah's violin." And so she agreed that would be her request. And 3 days later, when her father asked, "What have you decided upon?" she said, "I would like you to bring me Elijah's violin." And so he agreed and set off to war. Now the king led his troops to victory, and then he sought and found the gifts for his 2 eldest daughters. But he could not find Elijah's violin anywhere. He asked his generals, his wise men, and his soothsayers, but none of them could say. And so he set sail to find it. And in that way he embarked upon a journey that would take him to the 4 corners of the world. After many trials and tribulations, he was led to an old man who lived in a cave. And the old man said to him, "Elijah's violin is in the possession of the king of this country." He also told him that the king had a daughter who was imprisoned in stone, and a great reward for the one who could rescue her. And then he took 3 strands of hair and gave them to the king and said, "These 3 strands have been plucked from the bow of Elijah's violin. Burn them when you are in the presence of the princess." So the king asked the old man what he could give him in return, And the old man said, "There will come a day where you will repay me in full, for your daughter will set free the imprisoned melodies." The king wondered at that and said to the old man, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Elijah." And then he disappeared into the shadow of the cave, and the king set out to find the princess imprisoned in stone. Now when the king came to the palace where the stone princess lived, he told his men to set camp there, and then he proceeded on his own. When he reached the palace gates and announced his purpose, he was immediately given an audience with the king and queen, for they had left orders that no one who offered to free the princess be turned away, but that anyone who tried and failed be put to death. And then the visiting king was brought into the presence of the princess, and it was a great surprise to see her, for she seemed to be both alive and dead at the same time, as if she was a living statue. But greater still was his surprise when she began to speak, for the enchantment under which she had fallen permitted her the power of speech, but no other. And when she was speaking, it seemed as though she was alive, but when she fell silent, it was as if she turned to stone. And the king asked her, "How were you turned to stone?" And she replied, "One day, as I walked through the palace, I came to a stairway I'd never seen before. I followed it, and it led me to a room with a mirror inside a golden frame. As I stood before it, my mirror image escaped from the glass and forced me to take its place within. Since then, I have been imprisoned in stone, with only my power of speech remaining. Many have tried to set me free, but no one has succeeded. There have been reports that someone who looks exactly like me has been seen throughout the kingdom, but she slips away like a shadow whenever anyone gets too close." And then she fell silent. And so the king took the 3 strands of hair and cast them into the fire, and no sooner had they started to burn than the princess turned into her flesh and blood form again. And the king said to her, "Now that you have been freed from the spell you are under, surely your mirror image has taken its place in the mirror again. In order to keep it there, you must blindfold yourself and shatter the mirror with a stone. In that way, it will be forced to remain in its world of reflections and will never take your place in this world again." And the princess did exactly as she was told. Now the king of that land was so excited, he said to the visiting king he could have anything he wanted. So the visiting king asked for Elijah's violin, and it was given to him. And now that he had the gifts for his 3 daughters, he sailed home. When he arrived, his 2 eldest daughters immediately took their gifts and hurried off to try them on. The youngest daughter first hugged her father, and then she took Elijah's violin to her room. When she opened the case, she found a perfectly carved violin, preserved for centuries, and next to it a bow. When she put the bow to the strings, a clear melody sailed forth effortlessly. While she was playing, it seemed as if the violin was playing itself, as if it had many melodies stored up that sought to emerge from within. Before she had finished playing, a handsome man appeared before her and said, "Why have you brought me to this place?" But she was greatly surprised to see him and said, "How did you get in the room?" And he pointed to the window through which he had entered. And then she asked, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "From a land far away." "And what brought you here?" "The music of the violin called me." At that point, the princess stopped asking questions, for she realized the violin was enchanted, and the man who stood before her was a prince. So whenever the princess missed the prince, she would pick up the violin and begin to play, and no sooner had the melody left her window than the prince would appear. In time, the prince and the princess exchanged rings and vowed that one day they would be wed. One day, when the princess was talking to the prince, her eldest sister overheard and went to her second sister and said, "Someone has been visiting our youngest sister in her room." And they sought to search it to find out more. And so they invited their youngest sister to the baths. But when they arrived, the eldest said she had forgotten her soap, and she would return to her room to fetch it. But instead, she went to her sister's room to search it. And when she found the ring of the prince, she threw it and smashed the window through which he entered. and when she found the violin case, she opened it and began to play. The melody that emerged was a dark one, filled with brooding. As the music filled the air, the prince was compelled to appear, but when he tried to enter through the broken window, he was cut by the glass and forced to turn away. When the youngest princess returned to her room, she sensed that something had happened. She picked up the violin and the bow and began to play, but the prince did not appear. Then she saw the broken window and 3 drops of blood on the curtain, and she realized her sisters had discovered her secret and brought harm to the prince. Saddened, she left the palace to sit on the rock by the lake. And again the old woman appeared and asked her what was wrong, and the princess revealed everything that had happened. And the old woman said to her, "First, you must tell the doctors that you are ill, so that they will order you be confined to your room, and no one be allowed to see you until you are well again. And then you must set out to find the prince, for only you can heal him. Pluck 3 strands from the bow of Elijah's violin and burn them when you are in the presence of the prince." And so the princess obeyed all these instructions. And she wandered through the kingdom, but she could not find the prince anywhere. Exhausted, she sat down beneath the branches of an elder tree, and she fell asleep. But no sooner had she done so than she realized she could understand the speech of the doves perched above her. When she opened her eyes, she heard only chirping, but when she closed them again, the language of the doves was clear to her. She heard them say that the prince was gravely wounded, and the way to his palace was impossible to find without a map, and a map could only be found in the leaves of this tree. So she opened her eyes and plucked a leaf and realized she could read it like a map. And in that way, she found her way out of the labyrinth of the forest and to the palace of the prince. When she arrived, she disguised herself as a man and presented herself as a doctor before the king, who told her 39 doctors had already tried and failed to heal the prince, and all had been put to death, and her fate would be the same if she did not succeed. She agreed to the terms, but requested to be left alone with the prince. When she saw him, she longed to embrace him, but remembering her purpose, she cast the 3 strands of hair into the fire, and as they started to burn, the prince's wounds healed. He opened his eyes. She took off her disguise and called in the king and queen, who were delighted to see that their son was well again. And the king announced that the prince and the princess would be wed. So it was that they came to be married, and they lived all their days in great wealth, peace, and virtue. And many were the times where the melodies of Elijah's violin were heard drifting over that land. Rabbi Dan says you can't clap in the sanctuary, so I'm never sure what you're allowed to do. My second story is called King Solomon and Asmodeus. So this would be considered an agadah, or legend, because it is based on the historical figure of King Solomon. Asmodeus, the king of the demons, is of course a purely fictional creation. The origins can be traced to the Babylonian Talmud, and the Talmudic Aggadot often serve to answer a question that arises in Torah. In this case, the question is how to fashion the stones that will be used for the altar of the temple. Normally, iron would be used in the process, but the Torah forbids this because of iron's association with war. The Deus Ex Machina is a mythical creature known as the Shamir, which can cut through anything. King Solomon and Asmodeus appear in a number of stories together, and they each have 2 major aspects. King Solomon, of course, has his wisdom, but he also has magical powers derived from God. Asmodeus is expectedly evil, but is unexpectedly subservient to God. Our story opens with King David's reign coming to a close and King Solomon's about to start. Now King David had a long and full life, and he saw that the time had come when he would soon take leave of this world, and his son Solomon would take his place as king. And so he summoned Solomon had said to him, "Now that I am growing old, there is a secret I wish to share with you, a secret I have been carrying for many years. It concerns a dream I had on the night you were born. In the dream, I was following a path at night when I came upon a ladder that stretched from earth into heaven. I stepped on the first rung, and I heard a melody like a distant harp, more beautiful than any I had ever heard. With each rung I climbed, the melody grew clearer. When I reached the top rung, I found myself in a city that resembled Jerusalem in every respect, except that the stones of the houses and streets were made of gold. An old man dressed in white approached me and said, 'Welcome, King David. We have been expecting your arrival.' I asked him for his name, and he told me it was Abraham, our first father. He led me to the entrance of the temple, where there were two other men dressed in white, fathers Isaac and Jacob. Together, they took me through the temple and revealed it to me in all its glory. Abraham said, 'The heavenly Jerusalem is like the earthly Jerusalem in every respect, except that the temple that has existed here since the creation of the world has yet to be built on earth. It is for you, King David, to bring this vision of the temple back to the world of men. When the time comes, you must share it with your son Solomon, who is about to be born, for he is destined to bring the temple on earth into being.' Soon after, King David took leave of this world and rejoined the fathers in paradise. And when Solomon became king and set out to build the temple, he had a dilemma. He needed to find a way to fashion the stones that would be used for the altar. Normally he would use iron, but iron was forbidden because iron was used to make weapons of war. He gathered his wise men and asked for their advice. One of them recalled the legend of a creature no larger than a grain of barley, known as the shamir, which could cut through rock the way a knife cuts through butter. But he couldn't say if the legend was true. And so Solomon conjured two demons, one male, one female, to ask them if they knew where the shamir could be found. And they said they knew of its existence, but only their king, Asmodeus, knew of its location. In fact, he might even have it in his possession. Solomon asked where Asmodeus could be found, and they told him he had built his palace on the highest peak in the mountains of darkness. There he had an underground cistern from which he alone drew his drinking water. Every day he would seal the cistern, place a large boulder upon it, and then leave to rule the kingdom of darkness. When he returned, he would check the seal to make sure it was unbroken, and thus assured, he would remove the boulder and satisfy his thirst. When Solomon heard this, he summoned his most trusted advisor, Benaiah, and sent him with 6 men to the kingdom of darkness to capture Asmodeus and bring him back. To assist them in their quest, Solomon first whispered a secret into Benaiah's ear, and then he gave him 4 things: a chain on which every link the name of God had been engraved, his magic ring on which the ineffable name had also been inscribed, a large skin of wine, and a bundle of wool. And so it was that Benaiah and his men traveled to the mountains of darkness. And when they climbed the highest peak and they found the cistern of Asmodeus, and they hid themselves in the trees. And when Asmodeus finally appeared, he was a terrifying sight. He was a winged giant with the feet of a rooster, the beard of a goat, and fire shooting out of his nostrils. As usual, he checked the seal, saw it was unbroken, had his fill of water, reversed the steps, and left. Benaiah and his men crept out, and they bored a hole at the bottom of the cistern, and out flowed the wine. Then they filled it with the wool they had brought, and they bored another hole higher up, through which they poured the wine. Water drained out of the bottom, if I said wine. And then they hid themselves in the trees and waited for Asmodeus' return. So he came back, checked the seal, removed the boulder, but when he pulled up the bucket, he was surprised to see that the water had turned to wine. And at first he was reluctant to drink it, but As he saw no signs of tampering, and his thirst was very great, he drank a bucket, and then another, until he grew drunk and fell to the ground in a stupor and was fast asleep. Benaiah and his men snuck out. They wrapped the chain around his wrists and his neck, and they hid again. And when Asmodeus awoke and realized he had been chained, he roared with anger. He tried to break the chain, but could not. At that moment, Benaiah and his men leapt out, and with Benaiah holding up Solomon's magic ring, they shouted, "The name of your master is upon you." And when Asmodeus realized he was under the power of the name, he ceased to resist. His power only flourished in the absence of everything holy. He allowed himself to be led away, and they traveled back to Jerusalem. On the way, he behaved in peculiar ways of which Benaiah took note. When they passed a wedding, he wept. When they came to a man who asked a shoemaker to make him shoes that would last for 7 years, he laughed. When they came to a blind man who had lost his way, he led him to the proper path. And when they met a magician who boasted of his great powers, he had nothing but contempt. When they reached Jerusalem, Benaiah shared his observations with Solomon. And Solomon decided to wait 3 days before receiving Asmodeus. On the first day, he instructed his guard to tell Asmodeus he could not receive him because he was drunk. And Asmodeus said nothing, but he took 2 bricks and he placed one on top of the other. When this was shared with Solomon, he laughed and said, "By that he means to say, you should give me more to drink." On the next day, Solomon instructed the guard to tell Asmodeus he could not receive him because he'd had too much to eat and was sleepy. And when Asmodeus heard this, he was again silent, but he took 1 brick down from the other. And when Solomon was informed, he said, "By that he means to say, you should give me less to eat." On the 3rd day, Asmodeus was brought before Solomon, and he drew 4 corners on the floor and said to Solomon, "Why do you seek to conquer the world? Is the kingdom you rule not enough for you? Do you also seek to rule the kingdom of darkness as well? Soon all you will need will be the 4 corners of a single grave." Now, Solomon ignored these questions and asked Asmodeus, "Tell me the meaning of your strange behavior on the way to my kingdom." And Asmodeus said, "When we passed the wedding, I wept because I knew the groom had less than a week to live. When we met the man who asked the shoemaker to make him shoes that would last for 7 years, I laughed because I knew he would not own those shoes for 7 days. When we met the blind man who had lost his way, I led him to the proper path because he was one of the pious ones whom even demons must respect. And when we met the magician who boasted of his great powers, I had nothing but contempt, for he could not even see the treasure that lay buried at his feet. Now, if you please, would you tell me why you have gone to the trouble of having me captured?" And Solomon replied, "It is my destiny to build a great temple in this holy city, to honor the King of the universe, who rules over us all, even kings such as you and I. But I cannot fashion the stones of the altar without the aid of the shamir, and you, I have learned, possess it." And Asmodeus said, "I do not possess the shamir, but I know it was created at twilight on the eve of the first Sabbath. It was entrusted to Rahab, prince of the sea, who in turn gave it to the white eagle for safekeeping." And Solomon asked, "And what does the white eagle do with the shamir?" And Asmodeus replied, "It places it on high mountain tops, which splits them to form canyons where wild fruit trees grow. From the fruit of those trees, the white eagle is able to feed its young." "And where can the white eagle be found?" asked Solomon. And Asmodeus replied, "It makes its nest on the highest peak in the mountains of darkness where I make my home." And so once again, Solomon summoned Benaiah to send him back to the mountains of darkness, but this time alone and carrying only a plate of glass. And when he had climbed the highest peak and found the white eagle's nest, Benaiah placed the glass upon it and hid behind a rock. When the white eagle returned, it could see its young, but not reach them. So it flew off to its secret hiding place and returned with a small object in its beak. This was the shamir, which it placed upon the glass. But no sooner had it done so than Benaiah leapt out from the rock and made such a noise that he frightened the white eagle away. And then he took the shamir, removed the plate of glass, and returned triumphantly to his king. So it was that Solomon was able to fashion the stones for the altar and complete the temple that was the house of the Lord, the mirror image of the temple in the celestial city on high. Thank you. Okay, last story. This one is called The Enchanted Journey, and it's also a ma'asiyah. It derives from one of the richest periods in Jewish storytelling, which is 19th century Eastern Europe. It concerns the fictional Rabbi Adam, who is best known as the transmitter of the Book of Mysteries to the Baal Shem Tov. But Rabbi Adam also appears in a number of stories as a powerful sorcerer who comes to the aid of Jews in danger. He derives his power from his knowledge of Torah and his trust in God. So with that, let the journey begin. Now Rabbi Adam, who had powers equal to those of the greatest sorcerer, looked in his magic mirror. He saw in a faraway land that evil ministers were pressuring the king to sign a wicked decree against the Jews. In fact, the decree had been written, and all that remained was for the king to sign it and affix his royal seal. And so Rabbi Adam took down from the shelf a bottle of ink and poured a small amount into the palm of his hand, forming a mirror. And then he unfolded from a prayer book a piece of paper on which was written the name of God. At that moment, every shadow and every echo disappeared, and everything became bright. Looking into the mirror, he could see the very room where the king and the ministers were meeting at that moment. Staring at that scene, he pronounced the secret and ineffable name of God, and in an instant was transported into that room. And all were greatly surprised to see him. They did not know how he had gained entrance to the palace. The ministers had lifted orders. No one was to be admitted to the king except themselves. But so great was their wonderment, they did not think to protest when Rabbi Adam said, "I need to have a word with the king." And in fact, they stepped aside to let him pass. The king was very curious to know what this old man had come to talk to him about, but Rabbi Adam would not say a word until they reached the well as they walked out into the palace garden. Once there, Rabbi Adam motioned for the king to look down, and when he did so, he saw the image of a ship standing ready to set sail in the surface of the water. Now the king did not know how it was possible to have the image of a ship in a well, and he raised his eyes to ask Rabbi Adam about it. But when he did so, he found himself standing on a dock in front of the very ship he had just seen reflected in the water. He turned around, expecting to see the palace, but there was just a vast wilderness behind him, and he grew very afraid. Just then, the ship began to cast off, and he had to run as hard as he could to catch it, and he managed to board it just before it set sail. The ship was at sea for many weeks, and the king tried to talk to the other passengers, but he could not understand their language. Eventually, that ship came to port in a beautiful city. All the passengers disembarked, and so too did the king. He wandered through the streets, amazed by the beauty of the place. Now and again, he would ask a passerby for the name of the city, but no one understood him. Eventually, he came to an inn, and he desired to refresh himself, so he entered and spoke to the innkeeper, who could not understand him. So hungry and dejected, he left the inn to resume wandering through the streets and markets. "What shall I do?" he thought to himself. "I shall surely die of hunger if no one can understand me." At that moment, he thought he saw someone he recognized. It was a Jewish musician who had once tutored his daughter. "He will surely help me," he thought. And the musician did indeed recognize him, but was greatly surprised to see him, for that kingdom and the king's own were at war. And he asked the king, "How did you come to be here?" And the king told him everything that had happened and begged him for something to eat. So the musician took him home and fed him a fine meal. And then the musician offered for the king to stay with him, for the king had nowhere else to go. At first, the king thought that he would sail directly home. But when he found out that kingdom and his own were at war and no ships were allowed to sail there, he was very afraid. He realized that if his true identity was known, he would be put to death. The king was not a foolish man, and he realized the war could go on for many years, and he would have to make a new life for himself in this kingdom. So as not to attract attention, he decided he would dress as a Jew and learn Jewish customs and beliefs. In the coming days, he found he greatly enjoyed his study of Torah and other sacred texts. In time, he decided he wanted to become a Jew, and he went through the steps of conversion. His host family was very proud of him. They held a festive meal in his honor. He continued his diligent studies until he acquired a vast knowledge of Torah. His great knowledge became widely known, and he was numbered among the finest Jewish scholars. Many an important man wanted him for a son-in-law, and eventually he married the daughter of a wealthy man. He became the father of 3 sons whom he loved dearly and raised in the spirit of Torah. One day, 7 years later, the princess of the kingdom grew gravely ill, and no one could cure her. So her father, the king, in desperation said the Jews must cure her or they would all be put to death. So the exiled king offered to help, but he did not know how. And when he was brought before the king of that land, he was reminded that if he failed, he and all the other Jews would be put to death. And then he was led into the presence of the princess. He examined her and saw that she had an abscess in her throat that was slowly choking her to death. But he didn't know what to do about it. But as he had become a Jew and put his faith in God, he decided he would pray. And so he put on his tallis and tefillin and went into a corner to pray for God's help. The princess had never seen anyone dressed this way before. She thought it was very funny. She began to laugh. And she laughed so hard the swelling in her throat burst open and her life was saved. And her father, the king, was so ecstatic. He said to the exiled king, "You can name your reward." And so the exiled king had 2 requests. One, that the king of that land issue a decree promising protection for the Jews of that realm for all the days of his reign. And 2, that he provide him with a ship stocked with provisions so that he could sail home. And the king of that land immediately granted both requests, and the decree was written that day and read in public. So it was, the time had come for the king and his family to take leave of their fellow Jews. For the king had revealed to his family long ago his true identity, and they had agreed to accompany him home so he could resume his life as king. But when their ship had been at sea for 3 weeks, a great storm arose and sank the ship and drowned everyone on it, except for the king, who swam to a distant shore. Eventually, he arrived exhausted on an island, and he threw himself on the sand and wept for the loss of his family. At that moment, he heard a voice above him, and he raised his eyes and saw he was in the palace garden next to the well. And beside him stood Rabbi Adam, who said to him, "It is time you returned to the palace, O king. Your ministers have been waiting for you for more than 2 hours. 2 hours? It wasn't 2 hours. It had been more than 7 years, and he had just lost the family he so loved. But he went back into the palace and saw his ministers, who were exactly as he had left them. And he started to tell them everything that had happened, but they just stared at him with disbelief. One of them found the courage to speak and said, "But your majesty, it was only 2 hours ago you left into the garden with the old man. What caused you to think that 7 years have passed?" At that moment, the king saw Rabbi Adam was still in the garden, and he ran out to him and said, "If you understand what is going on, please explain it to me, for my life has been turned upside down." And Rabbi Adam said, "It is true. You have been gone from your ministers for only 2 hours. Everything you experienced was a vision I showed you so that you would understand the full implications of the wicked decree against the Jews you were about to sign. And in that moment, the king realized that the vision had shown him the true ways of the Jews, which were not at all like what the evil ministers had told him. And though the memories of the past 7 years were still vivid in his mind, and his love and admiration for the Jews was unchanged, he found he had forgotten all of his knowledge of Torah. So he went back into the palace, and he ordered that the evil ministers be arrested. And then he wrote a decree promising protection for the Jews of that realm for all the days of his reign, and he gave it to Rabbi Adam. And then he chose new ministers from amongst the Jews. And the lives of the Jews of that kingdom flourished, and they lived in peace.
If anyone would like to ask questions of Aaron, he's kindly agreed to take them. Any questions that would like to come his way?
Do all stories or folk tales or what you call them have magic?
Yes, many of them have magic. I would say probably the majority of them do.
Is it a common theme that that there are kings who are in need of help and they promise execution for anyone who fails at attempting it, or is that just a general theme from a lot of stories?
So I'll repeat the question. The question was, if I got this right, is it a common thing for, I guess, was it people to be killed if they're not able to complete the task that's assigned to them? Yes, also a very common theme, particularly with Jews. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I thank you all for coming. Oh, so one more? Okay. So I have about 3 or 4 stories that I've told so many times that I only need a bit of time to get them into my short-term memory. But I've told them all here. And so I didn't want to repeat any of them tonight. So I learned 3 new stories. So these were all new for me. And I have been practicing to a wall near continuously for 2 months.
I want to ask you how much those legends helped you during the last few years when things kind of looked not so good and there was magic, there was goodness, there was good ending. Did it help you? Did you add some part of yourself into these stories?
Thanks. So I think you were able to hear the question. How have the stories affected me over the past years? Did I bring some of myself into them? So absolutely, the story is only part of it. The other part is the relationship between the story and the storyteller and the audience. And so, yes, these stories, they move me in profound ways, and they usually have happy endings, so they can give hope. And certainly in the dark times we've lived through, they've given me something very meaningful to hope for.
I thought they were all amazing. But did you write them? No, okay. No, they're wonderful stories, and the way you tell them is just really great. Thank you.
Even adults love to have stories told to them, and you make everything very visual. My question is, do you source only Jewish stories? I've attended Irish storytelling because they're pretty famous for that. And I'm wondering if you source your stories only from Jewish themes.
So when I initially started telling stories, I was telling stories from all different cultures. But I found that the ones that resonated the most with me were Jewish stories. And so at this point in my storytelling career, I only source Jewish stories because they speak to me the most, and I think I can tell them with the most authenticity.
So I'm trying to understand you. Basically, these are not your stories. So you get the stories from books, from what? And then is there a source? It's not from the Bible, from a book, or is it one book, or is it just a book of stories? And then also, do you create your own stories? And because I mean, we all telling stories about our lives. Every day we're speaking about our stories. So do you have? I thought part of the course tonight was about guiding us into our journey. Is there any ways that we can tell our story, maybe our family story? I interview my family, my parents, Is that part of the storytelling?
Okay, so for the second question, I have not been involved with narrative storytelling, stories from my own life. I feel these stories are much more interesting than mine. But certainly, there is very much a movement in Judaism and other communities of people gathering and telling their own stories. And there isn't 1001 Friday night here in Vancouver, but there are 2 storytelling societies. One of them is very similar to what you experienced tonight. And the other one is only for actual personal stories. They don't want to hear magical folk tales. And so there's definitely an audience for it. And I think that perhaps if there was support from the shul, there would probably be an appetite for having an open mic night where people can come and just tell stories of their own family, their own lives. But that's sort of outside my area of specialization. In terms of your first question, so I've used Howard Schwartz's anthologies a lot. There are many, many, many books of Jewish storytellers out there, but I just find that the language he uses is really magical and captivating. But I have about 3 or 4 books of different collections of Jewish story tales, and that's where I get my stories from.
I have 2 questions. First is, do you tell these stories to your children? I'm not sure if you have children, but do you? You do? Okay. Have you told these stories to your children, and what's their response? And the second is, do you have any favorite Jewish novelists? I know short stories, but any favorite Jewish novelists? Because I was thinking of Isaac Bashevis Singer and somebody like that as you told your stories.
So it's always challenging when people ask multiple questions because then you're thinking, oh, do I remember all of them? So the first one, do I tell stories to my children? Yes. Sometimes they've joined me at these sorts of evenings. Many years ago, when I had young cousins, I would be sharing these stories with them. So I've been sharing it with family for a while. In terms of Jewish writers, so the storyteller that I'm most drawn to is Reb Nachman of Breslov. And although I didn't tell a story of his tonight, I have told many, many of his stories over the years. And his stories almost always have a mystical, a magical component, and they're very mesmerizing. So that's I guess, my favorite.
Do you learn all these stories by heart, or do you deviate sometimes and do it more as it comes, or always the same words?
So I do try learning the stories by heart. Every time I tell them, there's going to be slight variations. I'm not going to have the wording exactly the same each time, but I'm trying to be very true to what the author has written down. So I'm not extemporizing and just going off in different directions. It's, if you hear me multiple times, hopefully it sounds fairly consistent from one time to the other.
I thoroughly enjoyed your stories. Do you ever feel maybe going forward an interest in creating your own stories? That when you can take information from each of the stories and create your own?
So that sounds really interesting and very ambitious. And I actually hadn't thought of doing that. These stories are very intricate, and a lot of plot twists that sort of get wrapped up in the end. So, I find it fairly challenging just getting the stories into my head, never mind blending several. So that's a definite maybe.
Well, seeing no further questions, it's my great pleasure to be able to thank Aaron for his presentation. Compelling stories, made compelling by your style and your ability to present them to us. And you may be able to get them into your head, but I suspect very few people here would be able to do the same thing as well. Aaron, it's been a great pleasure. Wish you many more years of storytelling, and hopefully we'll have the chance to have you back. Maybe you'll have to learn some more new stories for us. And I have down here, if I can reach it, a small token of our appreciation. We will be having refreshments in the social hall afterwards. I hope you'll stay for them so you can enjoy those and we can schmooze. Let me just remind you of our next presentation, which is on May the 7th. Pat Johnson speaks about Upstanders Canada, an organization that he founded to mobilize non-Jewish Canadians to stand up against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. That's on May the 7th. So once again, Aaron, it's been a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.